Some people disparage libertarians by calling them nothing more than a book club. But as is usually the case, when someone insults you, they are revealing more about themselves than about you. Who would want to subscribe blindly to an ideology not backed by a fierce group of minds vigorously contending with one another to better know truth and to refine the principles they operate their lives by? Today we bring you exactly that. Two minds with differing conceptions on those principles will challenge themselves and you and I in the quest for better understanding.
From Acapulco, Mexico, this is Anarchast.
Greetings, properties. Welcome back to Anarchast, your home for anarchy on the internet. Before I introduce our guests, I want to thank our epic level sponsor for this debate. Ed Bugos, the co-founder and senior investment analyst at the Dollar Vigilante, reached out, coordinated, and pressed this video that you're about to watch into reality. Thank you so much, Ed. Your support and your assistance is so much appreciated. As the world gets less and less balanced, it is vitally important that we have events exactly like this. So, with that said, it is my pleasure to introduce our guests for today. Curt Doolittle is a philosopher of science, testimony, natural law, and political economy. Welcome to the show, Curt.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It is a pleasure. Walter Block. If it moves, privatize it. If it doesn't move, privatize it. And since everything either moves or doesn't move, privatize everything. I'm pretty sure literally everyone has heard that phrase. Well, that is from our guest, the Walter Block. He is a professor of economics at Loyola University in New Orleans and senior fellow at the Mises Institute, author of 500 articles in professional journals, 24 books, and thousands of op-eds. Block is a leading Austrian school economist and an international leader of the freedom movement. Welcome to the show, Walter.
Thanks for having me too.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm not going to bloviate a bunch.
Walter is also, give Walter another compliment. Walter is also exceptional at helping people along their path to learning, and he helps people write lots of papers. And he helps people a lot and learn lots of things. So it's more than that. So.
Awesome.
Thank you, Curt.
So I'm not going to bloviate a lot. I'm just going to quickly go over the format and let you guys know kind of what's going to happen. It's going to be a quick time debate. We're going to go 15 minutes starting with Curt, 15 minutes to Walter, followed by response, 5 minutes. Response from Curt, 5 minutes. Then we'll do a discussion phase where they can kind of go back and forth, 2 minutes each. And that is the phase in which the audience will have its moment, its opportunity to ask constructive questions. My producer is working fervently in the background to monitor chat to make sure that you guys stay respectful and to collate and collect your quality questions for us to ask them at that point in the debate. And then we will close with 5 minutes each in the closing summary phase. So, guys, that's...
Does respectful happen in these forums? I don't know.
It happens on this forum. That's all I'm saying. All right. So, I mean, without further ado, Curt, I believe you get the first intro, 15 minutes. Take it away, sir.
Yeah. It's going to be hard for me to get through this in 15 minutes. Remember, I work in what's called analytic form, so it's a little difficult. But again, thank you, and thank you for arranging the discussion, and thank Walter for the willingness to debate us in one of these, especially in this time of crisis. I have the unfortunate position, or the fortunate position, of being on the end of a long line of thinkers, and I also have the unfortunate position of, quite by accident, stumbling into the job of consolidating their work into what's the equivalent of a Darwinian revolution of our age. And unfortunately, I pay the reputation price for bearing a similar truth and similar bad news. For this audience, let's just say that between Mises and Hayek, Rothbard and Hoppe, and those of us in the next generation, that includes me and countless of others in the field, in and outside the field, that we've used the classical liberal, libertarian, anarcho-capitalist program to discover and solve the hard problem of social science. We've done it and produce a formal logic of it. But to borrow from Nietzsche and others of similar wisdom, when you cast the light of understanding into the dark forces of time and ignorance, you may not like what you find hidden amongst the shadows. Since the secret of Western civilization is our heroism in speaking truth before face, regardless of cost, to the self, competence, or dominance hierarchies, I'm sort of going to continue that heroic tradition and beg your forgiveness in advance for painful truths that you might hear. And I hope you'll recognize the somewhat painful, equally painful rigor in the arguments, especially the difference between my use of adversarialism, in other words, law, operational logic and science, versus Mises' attempt to convert Jewish law into European justificationary logic, what he called praxeology, Rothbard's use of conventional moral reasoning, and Hoppe's use of Kantian rationalism. This difference in our methods reflects the profound cultural differences between the Jewish diasporic, continental, Marshall, and Scandinavian naval civilizations, our different group strategies, the different categories of thought we use to advance them, and the means of argument we use to advance and defend them. So the question is whether a just society is possible without a state. And there aren't any real paradoxes, only problems of definition and grammar. And philosophy, by and large, survives the onslaught of the sciences by little more than sophistry under the absence of that definition and grammar. So let's disambiguate this sentence and define the terms just, society, and state. Now, disambiguating these terms requires a set of definitions we call types. A type is a series of examples, like points on a line, that illustrate a constant relation between terms in a spectrum of conditions that together prevent the use of philosophical sophistry by suggestion, conflation, inflation, and then fooling us or letting us err or letting us deceive by subsequent deception, dissection by deduction, abduction, and induction. Those are the three ways. And as for justice, we'll begin with this sequence. Cooperation can go from undermining to conflict in one direction, or negotiation or avoidance to another. Our actions can be in display, word, and deed, or their opposites in inaction, silence, and going unnoticed. The consequences of those actions can from amoral to moral, ethical, good, and virtuous, or to immoral, unethical, criminal, and evil. Decidability in morality can be either go from unaffected to reciprocal and producing beneficial returns, or irreciprocal and producing losses. And the result is a decision. That decision is either we're unaffected by it, it was a just decision, which furthers our interest in cooperating, or an unjust decision, which furthers our interest in defection from cooperation. That's the cycle of cooperation. Now, justice refers to actions, experiences, and conditions produced by norms, laws, traditions, and institutions that construct and preserve acts of reciprocity within the limits of defection, and we call that limit of defection proportionality. If you want to research that, that's Jonathan Haidt's work. As for the definition of society and state, that's pretty easy by comparison. Don't have to go through so much disambiguation. A kinship group cooperates by kin selection. A society cooperates by norms. A polity cooperates by rules. We call these legislation, regulation, command, and whatever. And a state protects that cooperation by providing dispute resolution intrastate by law, interstate by preventing defection largely by trade, and intrastate and extrastate by warfare. The distinction being that a state may contain one or more governments, polities, societies, but a state provides the system of weights and measures, including that measure of dispute resolution we call law, that preserves cooperation and non-defection within the organization we're talking about. And governments and bureaucracies and everyone else then continue to abuse the hell out of them at every opportunity. So while you probably won't remember all that, it's not really important that you go. It's the most analytic piece I'm going to cover. That we can and have defined justice, society, and state. We have drawn attention to the fact that rule, state, and government are three different services. So now that we've defined our terms, let's discuss the question. Point one, man competes, or he fails to reproduce and dies. Nature is adversarial. Evolution as the result of evolution as the result of nature is adversarial. Unlike us, the universe can't predict and seizes the first opportunity to defeat entropy. We have lots of choice, so man competes against time, nature, and others of his kind. He competes less against kin, more so against kith, more so against allies, and more so against potential and existential threats. But he's never free of natural selection nor the threats of it. But he always seeks to be, and that's both the problem and the solution, because in seeking to avoid being the victim of natural selection, he succeeds in defeating it. Point two, man cooperates or is eradicated by those who do. That man acts as a common libertarian trope, but it tells us precisely nothing unless we disambiguate it into acting into the processes of observing, predicting, permuting our different options, expending effort in pursuit of advancing our interests. Even then, it tells us that we simply have more permuting ability than other beasts do. That man cooperates, on the other hand, tells us a lot. It means we can imitate the physical, empathize in the emotional, and sympathize in the intellectual, and in doing so cooperate, where cooperation produces disproportionate returns that are unavailable to other creatures, unavailable to those who don't cooperate, at the cost of relative brain volume that's 11 times more costly than muscle. So without cooperation, man dies. That's why ostracization has always been such a threat, and why the female instinct to being left behind because of the burden of her young is so panic-inducing. Ostracization through almost all of history has been a death sentence. But then cooperation is valuable, and we all seek it, and maybe we can't live without it, but what's the limit of cooperation? Just as the common theological trope is that some higher power demands our compliance, a common philosophical trope is to presume the infinite utility of cooperation. So let's avoid that, and let's make sure we understand our premises, the first three questions of philosophy, ethics, and politics. In philosophy, the first question is, why should I not suicide? Well, because I prefer to live. The first question of ethics is, why shouldn't I kill you and yours, take your women and your things? Just like the next question of politics is, why should me and mine not war, genocide, pillage, loot, rape, enslave, and serve, or tax farm you and yours? Well, because as the Khan learned when he asked this question of conquering China, it turns out it's more profitable to cooperate and tax people than it is to conquer and take their things. So cooperation isn't a binary but ternary choice. We can avoid, we can cooperate, or we can conflict. The first premise is not the presumption of cooperation. That's a fraud by which the deceitful frame any debate. So cooperation, negotiation, undermining, avoidance, and conflict. This ends the presumption of the infinite value of cooperation, and is why people don't actually do that. They don't infinitely presume a value to cooperate. And in debate, contrary to, I think it's Molyneux who uses that technique, in that debate, there is no assumption of mutual good when you're in debate. Most of the time when you're debating, you're actually trying to deprive the other side of opportunity. You're not trying to find the truth. So it also prohibits the fallacy of argumentation ethics, which Hott borrowed from the Marxists and many folks rely upon. Violence is always an option. Matter of fact, it's for the strong, it's a preference. It's just that we've increased the cost of using violence so much by cooperating to suppress it that it's profitable to cooperate or avoid cooperation instead. So what's the truth that limits cooperation? The weak beg, which is socialism or the female strategy, the able ask permission, which is libertarian, the ascendant male strategy, and the strong decide, which is conservatism or the dominant male strategy. Point 3, man organized or he is organized by others. Man cooperates, man competes to cooperate, groups of men cooperate to compete, groups of men that cooperate to compete survive best, groups of men that cooperate to compete by producing superior commons survive the best of all. So man organizes or he's organized by others. Point 4, states formed or are formed by others. Continuing the trend, we know why states emerge because they've emerged for the same reasons everywhere throughout history, and they fail to emerge everywhere throughout history for rather obvious reasons by the same means and that are tediously well documented. States form when an organized group of the strong succeed in suppressing local parasitism by murder, harm, theft, parasitism that's produced by murder, harm, theft, fraud by omission, fraud by suggestion, baiting into hazard, privatization of commons, socialization of losses, free riding, conspiracy, corruption, warfare by trade, warfare by information, warfare by conversion, warfare by immigration, military warfare, and they do this by lowering transaction costs by the institution of weights and measures, which is one of which is the law, commands or norms or institutions, and lowering the risk of that collectively increases cooperative economic and monetary velocity as a consequence, producing longer and more valuable production cycles and greater and wealth for all. This does not lower the cost per se. In other words, just by suppressing the local corruption and rent-seeking and that goes on, it doesn't necessarily mean you're saving money. It means that you're paying the central government to centralize it, so the friction of transaction costs and opportunity costs that are local to you are eradicated and economic velocity results. So why do states succeed? Well, states succeed because they make possible cooperation at increasing scale. The results of cooperation at scale provides a competitive advantage. This competitive advantage prevents their being displaced and replaced by others in the never-ending competition by cooperation versus competition by predation. So the point I want to get there is you'll probably see this habit I'm using, which is I'm using the via negativa. In other words, we aren't wealthier than cavemen. The reason we're wealthier than cavemen is we've made everything profoundly cheaper with time, but we have the same amount of time to begin with, and time is the basis of all human action. So why do states fail? States fail for lots of reasons. Most of them are overextensions. They overextend for a variety of reasons. I'm going to skip over the detail here. But my favorite ones that are most current are the failing to have a general staff in war games for every category of threat. We just failed on both on the political, military, economic, and biological war games all at once, when that's the whole point of having a state that does something, is having a general staff that is prepared, in other words, acts as an insurer of last resort. They fail to adapt to technology or means of warfare like the Japanese did. They fail from bureaucratic overexpansion. They fail, as we're failing right now, from privilege overexpansion, military overexpansion, all sorts of things. So why do groups without states fail is more interesting. They fail because they're unable to organize innovation, production, distribution, trade, institutions sufficient to produce the commons, sufficient to produce the wealth, to hold territory, population, and trade from competitors who will make better use of that territory, resources, and trade. They can't produce. The real result is, if I go through, I'm going to skip over all these, but if we go through the people who haven't been able to hold a territory, Africans, Gypsies, the Ashkenazi, the Muslims, and the people who do, the Chinese, the Hindus, the Indo-Europeans, we could all through with their strategy. What the people groups are able to do is they're able to produce trust, and they're able to do that largely because they're able to produce homogeneity. And homogeneity.
1 minute remaining.
Again. Oh shit. No way I can do it. I can get through point 5. So given the physical laws of the universe, natural laws of cooperation, the laws of evolution, how many proposed ethical and moral systems are not ethical or moral or at all, but merely frauds by which to bait high trust people into the hazard of ignoring the physical laws of scarcity, natural laws of reciprocity, and the natural law of evolution we call selection? And the answer is all of them. Now, you want me to just drop off there? Or do you want me to continue? I'm waiting. Well, I'm going to continue then. This is the reason for the evolution. I'm waiting. Hello?
All right, Walter, you're up.
Well, thanks for putting me on with this, and thanks for Curt. I'm not supposed to comment on him until the next 5 minutes, but I have to say it was exhilarating. Let me start now. The debate topic is a state necessary for just society? I would go so far as to say the exact opposite, that if we had a state, then we couldn't have a just society. Because to me, a just society as a libertarian means that you adhere to the non-aggression principle. You don't grab other people or their property without their permission. So a state does that. For example, the state taxes people. Well, taxes are compulsory. I mean, they're always saying, well, April 15th comes around, it's a voluntary tax system. But, if you don't pay your taxes, it's not very voluntary. They're going to send you a nice letter. Hey, did you forget? Then they'll send you another letter. We really need the money. Come on, get with it. But eventually, there's going to be a guy with a blue suit and a gun and a badge, and he's going to say, come with me. And if you don't come with him, and, they put you in jail, and this is not voluntary. This is a violation of the libertarian non-aggression principle. So you really can't have a state and be just if by justice you mean the non-aggression principle. Now, there are people who say, well, it's really club dues. If you join the golf club or the tennis club, you have to pay dues. And taxes really aren't compulsory any more than club dues are compulsory. But that's not a good analogy. I reject that. Because if you want to join the club, the golf club or the tennis club, the chess club, whatever, you have to agree to do it. But who agreed to join the U.S. club? There ain't no U.S. club. It's not a club, not a voluntary club. It's rather a coercive institution. Okay, second point is Curt and I might get into a physical fight. And the argument is we need a government to make sure that Curt and I behave with each other. And, we need courts, and only government can provide courts. And you need a police force, although nowadays under the Black Lives Matter movement, we don't need police. But the argument for the state is we need police, and only the government can provide police. Well, if you agree with this, if you think that Curt and I might have a fight and therefore we need a government to make sure that the two of us behave, that is a physical fight, not a debate, a friendly debate, well, then we also need world government. Because right now, the relationship between Canada and Burundi, between China and Bolivia, between the U.S. and South Africa is one of anarchism. Namely, there is no world government. So if it's true that we need a national government in order to prevent the citizens from fighting each other, then by the same logic, we need a world government to make sure that the countries don't fight each other. Well, world government is a problem. I'm Jewish, and my people are always running away from here and there because, they don't like us, so we go somewhere else. Imagine if there was a world government, there'd be no place to run. But that's just my own personal fear as a Jew. But I don't think a world government is a good idea, even apart from that, because, well, yes, if you have an angel or, somebody like that, the head of the world government, okay, maybe. I mean, if Murray Rothbard or Ron Paul were head of the world government, it wouldn't be so bad. But, if we have a democratic world government, China and India, between the two of them, would pretty much run things. And, that I don't think is a good idea. At least not too many people favor the world government. Okay, the next point I want to make, and I've got about 10 points. Let's see if I can get through some more of them. The next point I want to make is about secession. We have a right to secede. Because if you don't have a right to secede, you're really a slave. The only problem with slavery was that you couldn't secede. Imagine if you could secede from slavery. They say, well, slavery is good. You could eat gruel and pick cotton and sing songs. You say, okay, I'll be a slave. And then they bring out the whips. And you say, oh, wait a second. I didn't realize you had whips. I quit. I'm seceding from you. Well, if you can't secede, then you're really a slave. So secession is very, very important. The Chaz group in Seattle, they're in effect seceding from the United States government. And, I'm not a big fan of the people that are doing that, but if a bunch of Rothbardians doing that, I would favor it. So secession is a good idea. Well, how far should we secede? Well, I live in Louisiana. Should Louisiana be able to secede from the United States? Yeah, because if Louisiana can't secede from the United States, then it's compelled to be associated with them. And one of the basic aspects of libertarianism is free association. So Louisiana should be able to secede from the United States. Should New Orleans, where I live, be able to secede from Louisiana? Yes, sir. Because we New Orleanians, we don't like the rest of those Louisianans. They're too bad in some way or other. They don't have enough jazz. I don't know what the reason is, but we want to secede. Well, okay, if New Orleans can't secede from Louisiana, then there's compulsory association, and compulsory association are things like rape and slavery. Well, I live in the Garden District. Should the Garden District be able to secede from New Orleans? Yes. And should my city block, I live on St. Charles Avenue, should my city block be able to secede from the Garden District? Yes. And should I be able to secede from my city block? Yes. So, in a sense, I'm really not against governments. I just want to have 7.5 billion of them, one for each of us. So when you ask a girl out for a date, you really can't ask her. You have to get your foreign minister to ask her foreign minister to arrange it. I'm just kidding about that. But the point is that the logic of laissez-faire capitalist anarchism or anarcho-capitalism is one government for everybody. We should all be sovereign. Because if you're not sovereign, other people can boss you around without your permission. Now, look, I'm not against bossing around. I'm married, so I'm used to being bossed around. Nothing wrong, as long as it's voluntary. Look, I used to play the violin in the orchestra, and the conductor would boss me around. He even bosses the wind players as to when to breathe. But they agreed to be in the orchestra, so there's nothing wrong with being bossed. But it has to be voluntary. Okay, another reason to favor anarchism is that governments mean deaths. There's literature by Courtois and Rummel and a few other people that attribute, 200 million deaths in the last century to governments? And that's apart from the wars that they're always fomenting with each other. So I think, we don't want to have murder. We don't want to have, that's unjust to kill innocent people. So if you believe in that, then you shouldn't be favoring government. Another one is, how do you start up a government? At one time, we had no governments. And I'm not talking about 7 billion governments either. We just had no governments. And all of a sudden, we wanted to start up a government. And think of somebody who was in the U.S. Living in, the wilds of Western Pennsylvania when the 13 colonies were on, or maybe Ohio, because that was outside of the 13 colonies. And some guy from Washington, D.C. comes to him and says, hey, we're starting up a government. And the guy in Ohio or Indiana, wherever he is, says, oh, that's great. I wish you the best of luck. We'll trade. We'll be friends. And the guy says, no, you don't understand. You're part of it. And the guy says, well, I don't join. Woody Allen or somebody once said, I wouldn't join any group that would have me. Well, here's a guy in Ohio who says, I wish you the best of luck, but I don't really want to join your government. And the guy says, well, too bad. You're part of the government. You're going to be paying taxes and we're going to rule you. Well, how is that just? Remember, the title is a state necessary for a just society? Well, this is the exact opposite of justice. Compelling people to join something? That's not cool. Then there's a contradiction. The government is supposed to protect rights, and it does so by first violating them. Here's the scenario. I'm going to protect your rights, and by the way, you have to pay taxes for me to protect your rights. Well, there's a downright logical contradiction here. If they want to protect our rights, they should either leave us alone or saying, hey, I've got a special deal for you. I'm a voluntary police force or a voluntary court. I'm the Better Business Bureau. I'm a defense agency, private defense agency, and I would like to have you as a client. And if you agree, I will protect you. Well, then that's okay. I mean, somehow they think that the government has a monopoly over armies, courts, and police, but anything that the government has ever done that's good, and armies to keep foreign bad guys off of us, police to keep local bad guys off of us, and courts to determine, who's good and who's right and who's wrong. They're all important. But any good function of the government is always done privately, even roads. One of my books is on privatization of roads. Some 40,000 people a year die on the roads, and these people that calculated 200 million deaths in the last century, they didn't even count all the deaths due to government highways. If we had private highways competing with each other, we'd have many fewer deaths. Another point I want to make is Somalia. Everyone says, "Whoa, Somalia is anarchy," and look at how bad Somalia is. Well, if you compare Somalia with Paris or with Canada or with any civilized country, Somalia doesn't really look all that good. Not that I agree that Somalia is exactly the Rothbardian version of anarchism that I favor, but okay, I'll concede for arguendo, sake of argument, that Somalia is an anarchist situation. But if you compare Somalia with the neighboring countries, the countries in Africa that are close to Somalia, all of a sudden Somalia doesn't look so bad. So you don't want to compare apples and oranges. You don't want to make the mistake of comparing an advanced society with a less advanced society and saying, well, Somalia doesn't look that good compared to, Sweden. But if you compare Somalia to the other countries near it, well, all of a sudden Somalia starts looking pretty good. How would anarchy work? Well, you would have privatization of police, privatization of armies, privatization of courts, privatization of roads, privatization of welfare. Churches and other groups like that would take care of welfare. Now, if I were to list all the problems that the government starts, and is responsible for, prohibiting drugs and what is it? Robert Nozick talks about capitalist acts between consenting adults. They prohibit drugs, they prohibit sex. Somehow it's okay to, if a boy meets girl and they go to bed, that's okay. But somehow if money changes hands, all of a sudden it's not okay. And then, government also screws up, organ transplants. We have, 80,000 people waiting on lists to get a kidney transplant. And the problem is the price is zero. So the incentives to supply kidneys and hearts and livers and stuff like that are greatly dissipated. Motorcycles are called donor mobiles because mostly young people ride them, and then they die very quickly when they die. And they've got these great organs, but then you have to ask their parents at the time that they're grieving, can you have an organ? So governments are responsible for massive deaths and massive dislocations and a lack of cooperation. And I think that the case for government is very, very weak. Why do we have so few anarcho-capitalists? Even among libertarians, I would say anarcho-capitalists are maybe 2%, and most people are limited government, minarchists, constitutionalists, sort of like Ron Paul or Mises, or classical liberals like Hayek and Milton Friedman. Why do we have so few? My explanation is sociobiological. We are not hardwired for economic freedom. That's why Ron Paul isn't president, or why Murray Rothbard didn't win the Nobel Prize in economics. That's why most of the major media and most of the university leaders, professors, not me and a few of my colleagues, but most of us are very much I was going to say to the left, but also to the right, because we libertarians...
You have 1 minute remaining?
Yes, we libertarians are neither the one or the other. So my claim is the reason that we are so few is because we are hardwired not to be in favor of freedom, not to be favor economic freedom. In the days when we were in the caves or in the trees, there was no real impetus for voluntary trade. There was much more of an impetus for benevolence. People are benevolent. Most people are, if they see somebody in trouble, they'll help them. But I get students in my classes at Loyola, and they come in and they think that rent control is great and minimum wage is great and price gouging is evil. That's because we had no socio-biological advantage in being in favor of free enterprise. Well, I've got 8 seconds, so I think I'll just conclude. And again, thank you, Patrick, for putting this on.
Absolutely. Okay, so back to you, Walter. You have 5 minutes to respond to Curt, and then it'll be Curt's turn.
Okay, well, this is sort of rough. I said if I had to summarize Curt's talk in one word, it would be exhilarating, and I stand by that. It was exhilarating. I'd hate to have him as one of my professors because, I'm busily taking notes, and it's really sort of hard to understand exactly what he's getting at. He went over so many different things. Praxeology, social science, cooperation, reciprocality, abduction, justice, laws, natural selection, adversarial, abduction, ostracized, theology, trope, suicide, enslave, conquer. By the way, one criticism, minor criticism, it's not hop. It's Hoppy or Hoppe. That's how he pronounces his name. But that's just a minor point. I certainly agree with Curt that cooperation is very important. And I got that loud and clear out of his talk, and I congratulate him for that. Cooperation is very important. But how does the government deal with cooperation? Does government make us cooperate more or cooperate less? Well, I think they make us cooperate less with each other. And, cooperation at the point of a gun isn't cooperation. And the government, if I had to summarize one word for government, it's coercion, or at the point of a gun. Yes, I agree with Curt that cooperation is important, but I think that vitiates against his supposed defense of governments, although I didn't really get that. See, what I was expecting and what I usually get when I debate people on anarchism are things like public goods, externalities, monopoly, free rider, inequality, things like that. And he hardly mentioned them. And, I'd really be hard put to say what his thesis was. I was expecting, government is great, and here's why. Here are 15 reasons why government is great, and here are another 15 reasons why anarchy is wrong. But I didn't get that. I was sort of ready to combat that, but I didn't get that. What I got was, I don't know, maybe poetry would be the best way to describe it. Beautiful poetry. He said a lot of good words, a lot of interesting words, but I didn't really get any thesis of the sort that, like what I did is I have a list of about 10 things that, anarchism is great. And if I go on further, why the government is bad, that would take me a long time. So there'd be something to sort of stick a fork in. Whereas with his exegesis, there's nothing really that I could grab and say, you're wrong on this, because I didn't get much in the idea, is a state necessary for a just society? I wanted him, or I expected him to say, yes, a state is necessary for a just society, and here are 5 reasons why. And he did have 5 points, but none of them were, yes, this is why government is great. Or maybe it's a necessary evil, but he didn't say that. There is one argument that he could have used that he didn't use, and that is, and this is a tough one for me, and that is maybe things are bimodal. Maybe we'll have less violence if we have a minimal state. Not a state of the sort that Barack Obama wants, but the sort of a state that Mises and Ron Paul want. Maybe, the graph goes like this, that if you have too little government, you'll have more debts, and if you have too much government, you'll have more debts. And maybe the ideal is a very limited government. And I would just say, that's not true, and we have no evidence in favor of it, and we have a lot of evidence against it, and government's always naturally accrete. But that was an argument he could have used, but he didn't use. I have another criticism. He used the word rent-seeking. I don't like the word rent-seeking, or the phrase rent-seeking. It was created by these, what do they call them? Oh, I forget the name of those people, Buchanan and Tullock, public choice. That's their shtick. And by rent seeking, they seem to think they're using the phrase as a synonym for theft. But rent seeking is a perfectly good thing. Profit seeking is a perfectly good thing. The problem with the public choice and this rent seeking is percolated throughout all of academia is a problem. There's nothing wrong with rent seeking. Yes, there's something wrong with theft, but to equate the two shows that you really don't understand the free enterprise system, which is something that is a very serious problem. Curt says states succeed by increasing cooperation. I would like to hear how states increase cooperation. I think states decrease cooperation by having minimum wage laws and rent controls and all sorts of regulations and tariffs and taxes and my pet peeve is organ transplants. I think without the state we would have a market in body parts, and then we could cooperate with each other a lot better than we now do.
All right, back to you, Curt, for 5 minutes.
Yeah, sorry, Walter. The reason you didn't get anything to hold on to is I didn't get to my closing point there. I said I would probably run over, and I would have. Unfortunately, because of the sound there, I didn't get a chance to complete it. So if you go, I'm just going to give my five points real quickly there. Man competes or he fails to produce. He cooperates or is eradicated by those who do. He organizes or is organized by others. States form or are formed by others. And states succeed and fail for relatively well understood reasons. So the problem I wanted to bring up, what I was summarizing, making the intermediary point, was that given the physical laws of the universe, the natural laws of cooperation, and the obviously evolutionary law, how many of these proposed ethical and moral systems, and I'll include Marxism, libertarianism, social democracy, whatever in them, are not ethical and moral at all, but merely frauds by which to bait high-trust people into the hazard of ignoring those physical laws of scarcity, natural laws of reciprocity, and the natural law of evolution we call selection. My first argument is all of them. In other words, I'm saying libertarianism is trying to make a claim that's counter to evolutionary pressures. So this is the reason for the summary comes up, and so what's a just society? A just society is one that is competitive enough to survive market competition for territory, resources, population, and time, while limiting the population to acts of reciprocity within the limits of proportionality, given the innovation and productivity of the demographic within the territory. In other words, you don't get to choose, the market chooses. We don't have the choice of having an anarchic society because the market chooses. Now, the question you have is, why is libertarianism so hostile to all the commons? Why is that? And why is Rothbardian ethics specifically avoiding, why is the NAP specifically limited to intersubjectively verifiable property? Well, the answer is that it licenses all the very crimes that are beyond the obvious. And so while you have gone through and you go through all these examples, and I have learned so much from you over the years, I've learned it from everybody, but the truth is that Rothbardian ethics are trying to preserve the ethics of the pale, and the Western civilization is built on a very different set of ethics, which is that you are responsible for producing commons. And so just so as Marxism is hostile to the production of private property, libertarianism is the production of commons, and hostile production of commons, and neoconservatism is hostile to the production of power, of elites. So the question I have here is why, I'm saying that all these philosophies that people come up with are honestly attempts to deceive, when we know what the one way of not deceiving people is, and that's rule of law of reciprocity, and that's Western civilization. There is no liberty except under Western civilization's rule of tort, the natural law of tort. There never has been, there never will be. The only examples that people give are places that are borderlands that some state gives out to some malcontents, so they can live in it, so the state can claim it has population there, so it owns the territory. But there's no anarchic community. If you even go to early pre-states, they always have a head man. There's always a government. And that's why. It's because humans don't act morally. They act at the limits of their immorality. In other words, people act as, it's the science, that's the evidence. People act at the limits of morality, not as morally as they can. And we wouldn't have the economic velocity produced precisely by the total suppression of all those kinds of parasitism that happens. So just as we move from warfare to physical to economic warfare to information warfare, people use from physical crimes to fraudulent crimes to informational crimes. And that's exactly what you see. Are people stolen more by the government today than in the past? Oh, sure. They stolen more by the financial sector than they were in the past. Absolutely. Why? But are they physically stolen from as more? No. All that's happened is it's shifted upward. So we can take European ethics and law, we can extend our law so that we can suppress these infinite number of deceits. I don't need to go any farther.
Okay, so now we're going to enter sort of our discussion Q&A phase. I already have like 20 minutes worth of questions from the audience, but I want to give you guys, a good 15 minutes to go back and forth with each other, 2 minutes each. Let's start with you, Walter.
Wait. I'm sorry. I had another minute there. I need one more minute because I didn't close up. The closing is that it's not about what government can we have or how just a society is. It's that what is the most just society we can get away with and still survive. Excuse me. There we go.
All right, Walter.
Well, I'm sort of up in the air here. I gave my talk, Curt gave his talk, and then in my 5 minutes, I try to comment on what he said, but in his 5-minute comment on me, he didn't comment on what I said. I talked about taxes are not voluntary. I talked about world government, secession, deaths. How do you start up a government? Why are there so few anarcho-capitalists? I talked about the contradiction. I talked about Somalia. I talked about how anarchy would work. I talked about some other problems, and he didn't say one word about any of that. So I don't know. I don't know what to say about that. Instead, what he did is he used his time to comment on what I said to continue what he was talking about. And again, I regard him as sort of a poet, philosopher. It's sort of like debating Curt is sort of like nailing jelly to the tree. You can't nail jelly to the tree. He's very elusive in maybe in a good sense. I'm not sure, but this is Curt's view. But I find it hard to dig in and say, well, look, Curt, you said this, and what's your evidence for this? And I don't see it, and I see evidence against that. He does say that Murray Rothbard deceived people, if I understand, and I can't understand, Curt, when you get your 2 minutes, if you could elaborate on how it is that Murray deceived anybody, and then this business of the tragedy of the commons. Well, I agree there's a tragedy of the commons, but that's because the government won't allow us to privatize stuff. If we could privatize everything that moved or didn't move, there wouldn't be any tragedy of the commons, which is why we have, animals going extinct because, the buffalo and the cow and all that stuff. So in your 2 minutes, I would ask you, Curt, if you could comment on something I said, and also maybe explain where you see deceit in Murray.
Curt?
Again, I had to finish because I got cut off, so I had to finish my point. I apologize. Walter, I realize that that it's a lot to absorb what I'm talking about. This is a common complaint from everyone. Doesn't mean it isn't there. It just means it's complicated. But that's the difference between the analytic method, which is what I use or what you use in court, and the rational method. You use appeal to reasonableness, and you use a sequence of appeals to reasonableness. But you will use also a lot of should. I don't use should. I use can and is. And so my summary was pretty simple: is a just society is one that can survive, right? And so it can survive while at the same time limiting the population to acts of reciprocity. That's what it is. Now, the problem is, can a libertarian society or an anarcho-capitalist society, A, come into being, B, survive competition for people or commons or anything else? Can it survive without being conquered, without even just failing? And so when you say I didn't answer your questions, it's because I'm going after the very premise of the idea that the should your mentions are even vaguely possible. And moreover, I'm saying quite the opposite. Not only are they vaguely possible, they're totally impossible. And that the only liberty that's ever been made has been made by the organized use of violence to deprive people deprive people of every alternative. And that organized use of violence only happened in one place. It happened in Europe. It only happened because it created the system we call rule of law. And that rule of law is rule of law tort, which is what we call property, all right, limits to property. And the difference being that Rothbard's ethics is dependent on intersubjectively verifiable property, and the test is blackmail, which you always come up with as voluntary, but it won't stop me as the strong from killing you for blackmailing me. So it's not a survivable society.
Walter?
Okay, I think we're getting somewhere. I think you're getting less poetic and more in my style or whatever. But I think your point about can and is more important than should. And I'm not sure that that's appropriate because, remember, the title of our debate was, is a state necessary for a just society? The title was not, is a state necessary for a surviving society? If it was a different debate, if the debate was, is the state necessary for a surviving society, then you would be right. But I think I'm right because the debate was, is a state necessary for a just society? And just is deontological. It's ethical. It's not can and is. It's more should. But I'm glad you raised that point. It's a very, very important point. Is a society of anarcho-capitalists, would it be able to survive? Well, let's look at the evidence. One of my books that I co-authored with Gortney and Lawson is we rated the economic freedom of all the countries in the world. And the freer the country, the closer it was to anarcho-capitalism. And the less free, the further away it was from anarcho-capitalism. And the freest countries were Hong Kong and Singapore and the United States and Switzerland. And I think Canada was up there and Great Britain. And then the failed countries, Venezuela, Cuba, places like that, were at the very bottom. You know, there's an aphorism in economics, wealthier is healthier. Other things equal, and you have to have ceteris paribus here, but if we had a bunch of people, an equal number of people that were dedicated to anarcho-capitalism, they would be filthy rich. They would be tremendously rich. They would be able, on an equal basis with an equal number of people, to fight off any number of these very, very poor socialist types.
Curt?
Well, this is a great example to bring up the fiction of capitalism versus socialism when the underlying argument is whether you have rule of law and produce moral markets, or you have anarcho-capitalism and you produce anything goes markets, or if you have discretionary rule and you have socialism or basically endless corruption. So I always view the anarcho-capitalism argument as somewhat specious, and not because people intentionally mean to be that way, but that it's a seductive argument. It's that those places have rule of law, and the most rule of law state that we have is Switzerland. It is because it's very small and it's infinitely defensible. So and it is probably where all the Templars went. So I agree with you, but when you're saying anarcho-capitalism, that's not true. They're not close to anarcho-capitalism because they specifically do suppress those kinds of the frauds and the baitings and the hazard and the free riding. They suppress all of them. And so ANCAP is just the opposite. It's ghetto ethics. It says if it's not physical, I can get away with it. Well, the problem is in Western civilization, we didn't have the luxury of the Fertile Crescent or the Egyptians or the the Indian flood river valleys, the Chinese Yellow River valleys. So we couldn't produce concentrated military forces and create that kind of friction between tribes. We had to rely on the militia. So we've always had this thing of the violence is never off the table. So what you're asking for in anarcho-capitalism is for us to pretend the violence is off the table. It's never off the table. So if you blackmail me or get me into any of the other games that you try to do, in other words, not warranty them, then the violence is never off the table. And for that very reason, Western civilization suppressed it, because they want to limit violence, because violence impedes, turns into retaliation cycles, which turns into hitting commerce, and eventually hitting taxes and people's ability to trust the people in power.
Well, there's an expression in Yiddish called Luftmenschen, people of the air. I think you're more up there in philosophy than I am down in the trenches in economics. But I'm glad that that I'm able to drag you back down toward earth. I'm not able to drag you all the way down, but I'm trying. We're now talking, I think, about can and is anarcho-capitalist society survivable? Well, look, if you compare, 10 people who are anarcho-capitalists, or 100 people, or 1,000 people, and you take another country that's socialist, like, I don't know, China or Russia or Venezuela, of course they're going to beat us, but then you don't have ceteris paribus. You have to have other things equal. Namely, if there were a country of pure Rothbardiana, that was the country, and it was tremendously rich, and it had 10,000 people. I'll bet you anything that if you take 10,000 other people who were not anarcho-capitalists, who were not Rothbardians, and everything else was the same, ceteris paribus, we'd kick their butt in terms of survivability. Now you say, well, Switzerland is not closer to anarcho-capitalism. Switzerland is very close to a lot closer than Venezuela. Which is closer to the Rothbardian view, Switzerland or Venezuela? And you're saying Venezuela is closer? My goodness. I mean, I would have to respectfully disagree with you. The countries at the top of our list, Hong Kong and Singapore and the United States and Canada and Switzerland, are very, very close, much closer to the Rothbardian vision. By the way, I have to show you a picture. There you go. You can't see the whole thing. I don't know why you can't see the whole thing. In any case, it's got a picture of Murray Rothbard, and he's an enemy of the state. And we now have an empirical disagreement. And also, I want to get into this thing about blackmail. One of my books is on the benefits of blackmail, and you keep criticizing blackmail, but I'm out of time.
All right, Curt, we have about, 2 more back and forths on Q&A, then we'll go some audience questions. Curt?
I mean, you're avoiding my 2 questions. The first one is, we've just illustrated the history of philosophy, which is that I'm Aristotle and you're Plato, and I deal with the real and you deal with the fantastic. All right, so you've already said whether it's possible survival isn't a question. And then I went down and said, well, it's actually those states are closer to rule of law because they have a higher standard of ethics than Rothbard does. And you said, well, these places are closer to Rothbard because they're not closer to socialism. Well, no, that's Rothbardian is still closer to socialism than it is to rule of law, because it tolerates every form of misrepresentation and corruption possible. So because all these things are. And then you haven't answered the third question, is why don't me and mine kill you and yours for your blackmail? Because it's not reciprocal. It might be voluntary, but it's not reciprocal. And if it's not reciprocal, then why do I let you live? That's what history. I always bring in the Genghis contest. Why do I let you live? Why? That's what ethics is. Ethics is removing the desire for me to end you. And so that's there's no other ethics than that. Everything else is, like I said, all philosophies exist to lie. There's only one truth, and that's tort. What's the empirical evidence of how people cooperate ethically? They do so when they don't impose costs upon the demonstrated interests of others. So, I hear what you're saying, and I can hear you trying to think I'm making an elaborate argument. What I'm really doing is I'm using strict construction to put the case together, which is what you would do in court, to say, this is the basics of man's behavior, this is what he does, this is what is possible to produce in a state, and this is why. And furthermore, there's a huge difference between rule of law reciprocity and Rothbardian ethics, which aren't reciprocal. They're only voluntary. And that's the problem. That's why they don't sell. That's why it's never sold. And that's why the only people who actually are attracted to Anarchists, that's why it's a tiny percentage, is because by and large, these are people who find no value in the status quo.
Time. All right.
So they're rejecting against it.
Walter, your image is frozen, but I think your audio is still good if you want to respond.
Why am I frozen? Can't you unfreeze me?
It's the tubes, man. Your audio's good though, so please continue.
Okay. Curt, I see the time right in front of me, and I've got a 50, and I guess they're not showing you the time. Curt, the next go around, you say I'm not answering 3 questions. If you could give me those 3 questions very succinctly, I will try. I'll try the best I can. Blackmail is a threat that if you don't give me money or whatever I want, I'm going to tell secrets about you. And I don't see anything wrong with that. I think blackmail is compatible with libertarianism. I've asked you where Rothbard was, lying, and you haven't answered that one. I'm not in favor of the rule of law. It depends upon what the law is. Look, in Nazi Germany, they had the rule of law. If you were Jewish or gay or black or you get killed. What's so great about the rule of law? The key is not the rule of law, but the rule of just law. And in order to get just law, you have to get into deontology and ethics. Now, again, you didn't answer my question of which 10,000 people would be able to win if there were a war. Very, very wealthy Rothbardians or poor people who were not Rothbardians. And now you ask, why don't you kill me or why don't I kill you? Well, one reason is we're civilized. Another reason is against the law. A third reason is you're not going to kill me because we're friends. And even if we were strangers, you're not going to kill me because you're afraid maybe I'd take defensive measures against you. But I'm not sure how that has to do with whether anarchism is just. So if you could just give me those 3 questions very succinctly, I'll try to answer them.
All right, this is our last back and forth before audience Q&A. Curt?
This is why there's no advanced books on libertarianism. Okay, 3 questions. 1, it's not survivable, right? 2, not survivable. 2 is rule of Rothbard is Rothbardian ethics leave open all the crimes that are non-physical that people always retaliate anyway, and therefore they're not ethical. 3, the rule of law is based on tort, which means property crime, and the difference between the reason NAP and non-aggression are half-truths, in other words, lies, is because they're called suggestions, and that is they don't define the scope of property, so every person who hears them interprets it according to his ethics. And so you actually provide solutions for all the things people they're fucking obvious about, crime, violence, murder, theft, rape, and whatever, but nothing that caused civilizations to fall apart, which are corruption, baiting into hazard, false promise, fraud, all the things that destroy trust in a commercial society. So it's really interesting how, why would you pick an ethical model that you gave out by suggestion that was a half-truth, that baited people into hazard, to allow them to accept this libertarian philosophy when their whole point is their civilization was built and dragged man kicking and screaming out of ignorance, superstition, poverty, hard labor, starvation, disease, child mortality, early death, the chaos of a nature all but hostile to life, in a brief period of geological peace, in a brief period of solar peace, and a brief period of galactic peace. In just a few hundred years in the Indo-European expansion, the ancient world and the modern, Europeans dragged mankind out of dirt. And we did it because of truth before face and rule of law. And you're trying to bring in this thing that circumvents rule of law.
Walter?
Curt, don't you see that you're out of time? You keep going over time, which isn't really fair. I still don't have
time. I don't care.
I still don't have, I think I've got 3 questions, and I think I've answered them all. Well, no, I've answered certainly the survivability one. I think I've answered that several times, namely that the richer is more powerful, and more freedom and more anarcho-capitalism will make you wealthier. And if it's an equal number of people, it's true we're not going to get an equal number of people for sociobiological reasons. But if we ever did, we'd kick butt. Second question, you say Murray Rothbard says only physical crimes are crimes? That's highly problematic, not to say wrong. I mean, Murray is certainly against fraud. If I sell you a bag of potatoes for $5 and it turns out it's a bag of rocks, I stole your $10. Fraud is certainly a thing that Murray and any anarcho-capitalist would oppose. You mentioned blackmail, but blackmail shouldn't be a crime, because blackmail is just a threat to gossip. If you don't give me money, I'll tell everyone that you take a bath with a rubber ducky or something like that. Well, where's the crime there? What's wrong with blackmail? I think blackmail should be legalized. And then you say that the NAP is a lie. I can't understand. All the non-aggression principle says is you should keep your mitts off of other people and their property. And remember, the debate that we're supposed to be doing is a state necessary for a just society, not for a survival society? But I'm happy to discuss survival, but I keep mentioning it, and you keep ignoring it. So we have a problem of lack of communication. Again, why don't you kill me and why don't I kill you? Well, it's against the law. You're afraid that I'll fight back, and also we're friends, so we're not going to do that. But about strangers, why don't you kill a stranger? Because it's easy to do that.
Okay, let's get to, let's spend about 15 minutes trying to answer some of these audience questions. We'll get to as many as we can, and then we'll do 5-minute closings from each of you. The first question is from Richard Heathen from Facebook, and I think this question is directed at Walter, so Walter will get 2 minutes to answer it, and then if Curt has any questions or responses on the topic, we can give him 2 minutes if he would like. It's optional. Why is non-aggression inherently virtuous, Walter?
Well, because it's nasty to rape people. It's nasty to grab them without their permission. It's nasty to go over and shoot innocent people. Virtue, I think, is there's more to virtue than the non-aggression principle. You have to be nice. You have to keep your promises. You have to not tell lies about people, whatever. But so the way I see it is sort of a Venn diagram. Out here is virtue, and a small part of virtue is the non-aggression principle. But the non-aggression principle is very virtuous because imagine the opposite of the non-aggression principle. Curt was saying, why doesn't he shoot me, kill me? Or why don't people shoot each other? Well, that wouldn't be virtuous is one reason. Another reason is practicality. They might fight back, or the government cops will stop you from doing that. The non-aggression principle is inherently virtuous because virtue consists of, among other things, keeping your mitts to yourself. That is okay. If I'm in a botch with you and you hit me in the nose, and say, oh, well, he aggressed against me because I've agreed to punch and be punched. Now, if you hit me below the belt or bite my ear or something like that, even in a boxing match, that would not be virtuous. But this thing, I have to tell you a masochistic joke. The masochist says to the sadist, beat me. And the sadist says, no. I hope you got the joke. Half the people never laugh at that. But the point is, there's nothing wrong with sadomasochism, even though sadomasochism is aggressive, but because the masochist agreed to be beaten. And if the masochist isn't beaten, the masochist will start whining and complaining. But apart from agreement, if a person just punched another person and says, well, I think you're a masochist, I'm going to punch you, that would not.
All right, Curt, if you had any response to that, you're welcome to 2 minutes.
Justification. Before we get to this question of virtue, we have to get to why shouldn't the strong eat the weak, so to speak? And it's because cooperation is more valuable. But then what are the terms of cooperation? The minimum terms of cooperation for the strong are reciprocity, and they're not met by Rothbardian ethics.
All right. Next question is from Andy Curzon. It is a question for Walter. He says, you say states mean deaths. Well, what are you measuring this against? Do you know how many deaths there would have been had there been no state? Walter?
That's a very good question. It's hard to answer contrary to fact. We don't know how many deaths there would have been without the state. A lot of people, what they'll do, who have questions like this, will say, "Well, look, if we didn't have the state, we'd have Antifa, we'd have the Crips, we'd have the Blood, we'd have the Mafia, people like that, and kill more people." And I would say, no. Likely, again, we're doing contrary to fact history, so you can't say definitively. But I think what the state has that the Blood and the Crips and the Antifa and the Mafia don't have is called legitimacy. Now, in my view, the pen is mightier than the sword. And you might think, well, the pen is just this big, whereas the sword is that big. If there was a fight between the pen and the sword would win. But no. The pen determines in which direction the sword is pointed. And that's where the government tries to make sure that the intellectuals, the professors, the clergy are treated very well and given all sorts of benefits and subsidies and stuff like that and honors. Because they are the very important intellectual bodyguard for the state. So that's if we had anarchy and we had gangs, the gangs don't have any legitimacy, except a little bit the Mafia in those Godfather movies where it had a little legitimacy. But apart from that, the state has got plenty of legitimacy. That's why the state is able to kill so many people. Whereas the gangs, the alternative, have so few people. So again, contrary to fact, history is hard to determine. By the way, I no longer see the time at the bottom of my screen, so I don't know when I'm supposed to. Oh, now I see it. It's in the corner. You snuck it in the corner. I'm out of time.
We're moving around, so it's hard to keep track of. Sorry about that.
No problem. I saw it finally.
All right. Curt, did you have a response?
I just say that the most stateless society is Islam, and it's responsible for 1 billion dead and the exhaustion and reduction to ashes and dysgenia every great civilization of the ancient world. So yet China has managed to gracefully incorporate group after group so that they all consider themselves, despite being genetically different, one large extended Han family. So I don't. The pen certainly isn't mightier than sword. What would happen to with Bredian society is that it would attract what we effectively call pirates and scammers, and eventually what happens is the United States send out the fleet to take care of the Barbary Coast. That's what happens because that's the people with the greatest incentive to join the Rothbardian society.
Okay, the next question is for Curt. It comes from Thorkill. I don't even know how to say that word, Verge. Question for Curt. Ask Curt to define morality. Curt?
Morality consists of reciprocity. Reciprocity consists of productive, fully informed, warranted, voluntary transfer, free of imposition of costs upon the demonstrated interests of others.
Walter, did you want to respond to that?
It's probably
too fast for it. I do. And I see my time limit here. Although I think I'm supposed to start with 2 minutes. Now I got 2 minutes. Great. Morality encompasses way more than the non-aggression principle. Morality includes being nice to people, being nice to your parents, being nice to your kids, even when your kids or your parents are in the wrong, keeping promises, behaving nicely, smiling, being nice. And it also includes the non-aggression principle of don't initiate violence against innocent people. You can only use violence in defense, not to attack innocent people. Now, I wanted to get back to what Curt said, that Islam is the most stateless society. Look, if you would ask Murray Rothbard or any Rothbard make a list of all the countries which are the closest to his vision of anarcho-capitalism and which are the furthest away, he would put Venezuela and Cuba and the Islamic states way, way at the bottom. And now Curt is inverting this. He's saying that somehow Switzerland is furthest away from Murray Rothbard, and Canada and the U.S. are very far away from, and whereas the Islamic states and Venezuela and Cuba are really what Murray Rothbard was advocating. Well, there's a problem here. I mean, this is just, I don't want to say Curt is downright lying. That would be impolite, but I'd say he's mistaken. I mean, Murray would never in a million years do that. Curt is trying to put words into Murray's mouth or in my mouth. I'm an anarcho-capitalist. I'm a Rothbardian, and I say that Islamic countries in the Middle East and Venezuela and Cuba are the furthest way. Now, if Curt was right, then I would give up anarchism. But but he's not right. He is absolutely mistaken and in the most blatant way. And I can't imagine that an intelligent person like Curt would actually believe this, but he's repeated it several times, so I have to believe it.
Okay, next question is for Walter from Ashley. Question is, why is your theory of property prescriptive? Can't people appeal for what they deem damages to their property in court instead? Walter?
Could you write that down on the screen like you wrote the other questions on the screen? There it is. Great. Thanks. My theory of property is prescriptive in the sense that it's a should, it's an ethical claim. It's also descriptive, but it's certainly deontological. The idea is that it's just to have property. And what is our property? Our main piece of property is ourselves. I own this body. Punch me or kill me or something, you are violating my property rights. So I have, as a libertarian, a prescriptive theory of property, and it's not just my body, but it's also my possessions. I have this pen. If you steal this pen from me, you're a bad kid. You're a rotten kid. You shouldn't be stealing my pen. Okay, can't people appeal damages to their property in court? Yes, certainly we should do that. Hopefully a private court would be better than a government court, because private courts, the judges be determined based on competition, whereas judges nowadays are based on political processes, which are problematic. But yes, now, when you talk about damages, it has to be physical damages. It can't be pecuniary damages. For example, if I paint my house pink and blue, and now I ruin the value of your house next door, well, I've damaged you in a sense, but you don't own the value of your property. You only own the physical aspect of your property, and I haven't touched your property. And if you're really worried about that, what you have to do is get a condominium association and make the rule that no hippies or people that paint their houses pink and blue, or there's a thing called a front lawn fornicator, people who fornicate in their front lawn and lower the property values. If you want to stop that, get a condominium association where you have rules, but it's all voluntary and everyone has to agree. Now, some people, even libertarians, complain about condominium association. They're so meticulous in their rules, but you've agreed to be part of it, so shut up.
All right, Curt, any thoughts?
No, well, that would I'll do my usual legalization. Your body exists. You can demonstrate an interest in something. You can have something in your possession, whether you can exchange reciprocal defense for something and call that contractual property. You can create an organization or a norm that defends it and create the norm of property, or you can create an institution of insurer of last resort that creates the property rights. But one of the things that frustrates me is this conflation over its property. You have a demonstrated interest, but property only exists by exchange.
Okay, this will be our last question, and then we'll get to closing arguments. This question is to Block. He says, what if someone uses blackmail to, say, coerce property? Blackmailing would seem to be a form of undermining. If blackmail can be used to steal property, why would it be okay in anarcho-capitalism? Block?
Well, one of my books, an entire book is on that. And I say I'm not going to do justice to it in 2 minutes, but I'll do my best. But if you're really interested, just Google block and blackmail. Not that I'm a blackmailer, and you can get the essence of it. Well, look, you have to distinguish between blackmail and I say, if you don't give me money, I'm going to kill you. Or if you don't give me money, I'm going to kidnap your kids, torture them. Well, that threat is an illicit threat. See, what blackmail is a licit threat. It's a legitimate threat. If you don't give me money, I'm going to tell everyone you take a bath with a rubber ducky. Do I have a right to tell everyone that you have a bath with a rubber ducky? You're darn tootin' I do. Whether it's true or not, I have a right to say it. It's just gossip. Even the most biggest totalitarians are not against gossip. Well, sometimes they do say, I think there was a Philippines or somewhere where they had a law against gossip, but we're more civilized than that. We allow gossip. So if my only threat, you see, there's nothing wrong with a threat. Look, I now threaten you that if you don't give me that shirt, I'm not going to give you the money. That's what I threatened when I bought this shirt. And you know what the Mises Institute threatened me when they sold me that shirt? They threatened me that if I don't pay for it, they're not going to give me the shirt. There's nothing wrong with a threat. It depends upon what the threat consists of. If the threat consists of a violation of the non-aggression principle, that's extortion. On the other hand, if the threat just consists of something I have a right to do, namely, I have a right not to give you this pen unless you give me money, well, then there's nothing wrong with that. So blackmail should be legalized because it's a victimless victim. It's true you'd be better off if I didn't exist, but that's a different issue. Look, you'd be better off if I didn't exist if I was competing against you, but that doesn't mean that competition should be against the anarcho-capitalist system either.
Curt?
I think I've answered this already, but I'll get back to it again, is it doesn't matter what you rationalize. You notice how I don't do any of this prevarication. I just say what is and what people do, and therefore what's possible. So it doesn't really matter what we can dream up that's in our interests. People will hurt you for doing those things, and this purpose of the state has been to suppress anything that would cause involuntary transfer, so that you're forced into engaging in productive, fully informed, warranted, voluntary exchange. And so if you can't do that, then there's no reason to allow you here. I want to know why, the first example is, why don't I kill you? The second is, why do I allow you here? And if we have people engaging in these kind of behaviors like blackmail, what happens to them? Well, they get killed. They get taken to alleys, they get put away. People invent laws to stop them. Why? Because it's not productive, it's not reciprocal. So the difference is, again, it's Plato's fantasy world. That's why I'm against philosophy and I deal with law, and Aristotle's science. I just do science. I'm telling you what it is. If you want to write literature to make up fantasy books and you want to dream in a fantasy, go write a Tolkien, because that's what libertarianism is. It's a fantasy world. It can't survive competition. Why do people even go to it? The reason people are drawn to it is because they can't compete.
Okay, let's get to our closing statements. You have 5 minutes, starting with Curt.
I think what I've tried to do, what do I want to summarize with? What I tried to do today is I want to get across the idea that there's only one source of liberty. It's when a bunch of guys get together, pick up arms, and say, we're going to have sovereignty. And by producing sovereignty, we're going to produce the condition of liberty and freedom, for liberty for those who have resources and freedom for those who don't. So we're going to produce sovereignty, liberty, and freedom. The most profitable way to do that is rule of law. And the only way that a militia, a group of men, will tolerate it is if it's rule of law, because only that way is reciprocal. So that's the whole secret to Western civilization. On the during the inter-European expansion, just by complete strategic luck, some guys developed the contractualism, the contractual form of government, and they invented tort law. They invented tort law, and because they were soldiers, they had to report, which means testify. Since each of them are sovereign, that means we get jury and fang and Senate and democracy down the line, but we keep rule of law. We even survived the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic Dark Ages, and we got Aristotle back, and all of a sudden, bang, we come back together. That's because truth is truth. The truth is our competitive advantage. And the reason is we can innovate faster than all other civilizations combined and drag mankind in ourselves into wealth. So I'm sitting here thinking about, well, you can fantasize about this, but I live in Ukraine, right? I live where there's no state, really. I live in what is exactly a world full of exactly what libertarians want. It's a world run by gangsters. There's 24 families. They own the government. If you want to go to a case, you pay for it, and you either get in prison or you pay enough to get out. That's it. People live in poverty. They're the only poor white people left in the world because they can't produce anything of economic velocity, because between the corruption of the government and the corruption of the gangsters, the people are basically suffering. So why did this whole thing happen? Russia wants to pull them in, and Euro wants to pull them in. But anyway, that's Ukraine. And guess what? Ukraine is where Rothbardian ethics come from. So if you ask me what it is, I know the answer. There's no truth, there's no value in libertarianism. The answer is pick up arms, create a constitution, put in rule of law, enumerate your rights. Those rights extend to any imposition across you. Give no incentive for people to hurt you, and then you will no incentive for people to get away with anything except productivity. Drive every human being there is into productive, voluntary, fully informed voluntary exchange is warranted and free of extra imposition of cost by the exchange, and then you'll have wealth. Because you don't get Switzerland's by Rothbardian ethics. You don't get Venezuela's by being close to Rothbardian ethics. You don't get Hong Kong's by Rothbardian ethics. What you get is you get rule of law. And rule of law allows people to take increasingly complex risks, increasingly far out in time, with increasingly high trust, because no one can get away with scams. And that's the difference between Rothbardian ethics and rule of law. And so it's not a question of capitalism versus socialism. That was just another scam. It's rule of law, and you have moral capitalism, or you have arbitrary rule, and you have corruption, or you have anarchy, and you have crime. That's it.
All right, Walter, let's get your 5 minutes on the clock. There we go. It's on you, Walter.
This debate isn't as sad as I'd like because Curt doesn't answer my questions. Rule of law. And I say, well, I'm against the rule of law because I'm only in favor of the rule of just law, and he never responds to that. He makes up things out of the whole cloth about Murray Rothbard. Murray Rothbard now is a favor of Ukrainian gangsters. I mean, suppose I called Curt a Nazi or a commie. I mean, they would be on the same level. This is, not a proper style of debate where you make up things out of the whole cloth about your opponent and then you attack that. Murray Rothbard would hate Islamic State. He would hate the gangsters. He would hate Ukraine. And I don't have to refer to Murray. Murray was my mentor, my friend. I am an anarchist, and I think that Venezuela and the Islamic States and pirates are the very anathema of free enterprise. I'm an anarcho-capitalist. I'm not a left-wing anarchist. I'm not a socialist anarchist like Potkin or any of these people. I'm a anarcho-capitalist. So what Curt is doing is continually, in a sense, putting words in my mouth and then attacking that. Well, I could do the same thing with him. Curt's a Nazi, and I'm against Nazism. Now, I'm only doing that I don't seriously believe that. It's interesting. I thought he was a libertarian just against capitalism, but it turns out that he's even against libertarianism, plain old ordinary libertarianism. I didn't realize that. Then he says blackmail is not productive. Well, productivity is in the eye of the beholder. Blackmail is productive because If I find out that you're seeing another woman and you're married, and now I get $1,000 out of you, that's going to discourage that sort of a thing. So it's productive in that sense. And productive from the Austrian point of view is both parties gain. Well, I gain because I now threaten that if you don't give me money, I'm going to tell everyone that you're a bigamist or whatever you are, or you take a bath with rubber ducky. So I'll gain money. And you also gain because you're better off by paying me. Otherwise, you wouldn't pay me. So why say blackmail is unproductive? Then Curt says, well, Murray is only against physical violence. And I say, well, he's against fraud also. And Curt doesn't reply to that. Stuff. Murray is not bad check writing, embezzling. Murray doesn't favor that. Now, if Murray favors all that, or I shouldn't use Murray, anarcho-capitalist libertarians or any of us favor that, then what you're doing is making straw man out of position and then it. Let me use the last minute or two to reiterate my point about why libertarian anarcho-capitalism is a just system. Because after all, this debate was supposed to be, is the state necessary for a just society? Well, the state taxes people. That's unjust because we didn't agree to, and it's not club dues. Then there's the world government argument. If you oppose anarchism, the logical view is to favor world government. And yet most people don't favor world government. Therefore, they are really anarchists deep down if they would only be more systematic in their thinking. And then secession. Look, I'm married, let's say, and I want a divorce, and I want to secede from my marriage. I don't, but suppose I did. I have that right. Otherwise, if I don't, then I'm in effect a slave. And I didn't agree to slavery. So secession is a right. Not only secession from one state to another or whatever, but down to the individual level. Because if you can't secede, you're not free. And I favor freedom. I favor justice. Now, I think Curt's most powerful argument is that such a society is not stable. It wouldn't. And here we have to have hypotheticals. Look, I was going to do contrary to fact conditionals with one of the questions. I say if you hold other things constant and you had an anarcho-capitalist society, it would be vastly wealthier than any other society, mainly because of Mises's insight about central planning. And person for person, we'd be able to kick butt. We would be very, very stable. The problem is that there are so few people that believe in this to a great degree because of misinformation spread around by people like Curt. So while I enjoy being exhilarated by him, I really can't agree with much of what he has to say.
Okay, gentlemen, that concludes our debate for today. I appreciate both of you taking the time and having this meeting of the minds and meeting it out. I would ask the people in the comments as you watch this video not to do that stupid thing that always happens on the internet during debates where you start in all caps talking about who won and who owned the other. I would rather you spend time in the comments, either on this live video or down below when you watch it later, to tell us the argument that changed your mind or that you think was the most salient or important argument in this debate so that others can actually have a real conversation rather than just cheerleading for whatever team you came here on. Thank you both. Thank you, Curt. Thank you, Walter, for taking the time and coming on the show today. If you guys would ever like to do another debate in the future, please let me know. We can certainly set that up. And for the audience, if you'd like to sponsor a debate and set something up, well, reach out to us and we'll get it set up. Thanks, guys.
Thanks again for having us.
All right, awesome. We'll end it here, guys. Thanks for watching.